The federal government's $188 billion infrastructure program is being hampered by a lack of spending by the provinces. That's one of the conclusions in the latest study by the Parliamentary Budget Officer, Yves Giroux. The Trudeau government's signature program for economic growth depends on cost sharing between Ottawa, the provinces, and municipalities. But today's PBO study finds that while major municipalities have used the program to leverage funding, some provinces have reduced their spending relative to Ottawa. Joining me in the studio to go over the results is Parliamentary Budget Officer Yves Giroux. Welcome, thanks for coming in.
My pleasure, thank you.
I found this particularly fascinating study because your office has also looked at, for example, the fiscal capacity of the provinces. You've had other studies of infrastructure, but this one looks at how much the provinces are spending and how much the municipalities are spending. Is this program turning out to be a flop because of lack of spending?
Not at all. What we looked at was whether the provinces and municipalities were spending on infrastructure at the same rhythm that one would expect, considering these massive investments of the federal government. So to do that, we not only looked at the absolute level of spending, but we looked at the level of spending that one would have expected, for example, assuming population growth, inflation, and so on. And we looked at that, and we also looked, that was one benchmark. We also looked at what would one expect with the infusion of federal cash. So that was the second benchmark. So we looked at that and we compared with the actual spending, and we found that provinces and territories had flatlined their expenditures on infrastructure for the first year of the program, and then increased it in the second year, but not to the rhythm that one would expect, considering in the absence, for example, of the infrastructure program, or even with the infrastructure program, the federal program. So we found that there's about a $5.4 billion gap.
Okay, so one of the reasons I ask, though, is because if this is important, it's that the whole program, one of the selling points of it is that it's stimulating the economy. Mm-hmm. You looked at the federal government's forecasts of how much it would, or your forecast of how much you think the program could have done if the expected funding from the provinces and territories came in terms of economic growth and in terms of job growth. What did you find in terms of expectations and in terms of what it's delivering?
Well, we found that had provinces and territories invested at the rhythm that was or is commensurate with the federal investments, then there would have been $5.4 billion additional dollars investment from provinces and territories, and this would have increased GDP by about 0.15%, which is not a huge amount, but the job creation would have been 7,500 to 8,000 additional jobs. So there's 7,500 to 8,000 jobs that have not been created as a result of the provinces and territories' investments not keeping pace with the federal investments.
So fewer jobs than would have been hoped.
Exactly.
Now this is all if the provinces and territories spent as Ottawa would have liked them to spend.
Exactly. That's assuming that they would have spent at the same rhythm and would have kept pace with the federal investments that were made in infrastructure.
Okay. In your study, you also point to some cases where major municipalities have increased their spending and have increased their spending more than provinces and territories, so that you say they've leveraged federal spending, and in fact, I think we've seen some projects that have been directly negotiated with municipalities, with the big cities, for example. Can you give us some examples, or what did you find?
We looked at a couple of big municipalities in Canada, because there are thousands, literally, of municipalities. It would have been a gigantic task to look at every single one of them. So we focused on 5 of the biggest municipalities: Montreal, Vancouver, Toronto, Edmonton, Calgary, if I'm not mistaken. And we found that in the vast majority of these cases, they contributed significantly of their own money to leverage the federal investment. So they invested of their own money commensurate or proportionally to the federal money that was being sent their way.
So they're saying, hey, the feds are here ready to pony up to match money.
Yes.
So we're going to find money that we might not have even found before because the feds are offering to match our money.
Exactly. It's a very good deal. We spend $1, the feds match it by an additional $1. Various programs have different matching requirements, so it's a good deal. Let's let's add incremental funding to our already existing plans for infrastructure.
But you're finding that the provinces are not doing that, or not to that extent.
Not to the full extent that we would have expected. So what could have happened, what may have happened in the case of provinces is that they either displaced some of the money, so they did match the federal money for specific infrastructure because that's part of the requirements, and they may have underspent in other areas. So, for example, there's ribbon cutting with the federal government for specific projects. They provide their share, but they quietly underspend on other areas where it's not in the limelight, or they invest but at a slower rate in these other projects.
Is there then an element, can you say, of provinces, provincial governments saying, well, why should we spend if Ottawa's going to spend?
Well, that's a good hypothesis. It's quite likely that that is exactly what happened. It could be due to delays in finding projects that are shovel-ready or ready for advancement. It could also be what you hinted at. There's federal money coming in, let's match for these projects that are on the table and that are the subject of announcements, but let's slow down on other projects to alleviate some of the financial pressures that provinces have been suffering from extensively in some cases.
Okay, I want to get to that in a second. Are there, I mean, I'm going to put you on the spot. Are there some provinces that have been really shone for not having spent much, not having ponied up much, not having matched what the feds would have liked them to have matched?
Well, I wouldn't be able to identify one or two specific jurisdictions. We didn't go down to that level.
Okay.
There are some numbers in the report, but given it's only for 2 years, I think it would probably be unfair to identify specific jurisdictions because they're all in different phases of their own cycle, electoral, financial cycle. So I wouldn't identify specific jurisdictions.
Okay, so we've identified one potential reason why provinces wouldn't spend as much as expected or hoped, and that is sort of being on Ottawa's shirt tails. Yeah. We can get along on Ottawa's shirt tails if Ottawa's going to spend. What about the other two? Your predecessor in the PBO, Mr. Fréchette, identified the state of fiscal, the indebtedness of provinces is some of it because provinces don't have the fiscal margin, and is some of it ideological?
Ideological, I'm not sure. Infrastructure needs are there. It's quite obvious. So I'm not sure that there are that many jurisdictions in the country where investments in infrastructures are not needed, or needed but not deemed a priority by the government. It's possible at the margin that there are some specific investment decisions that some provinces don't want to get into, but generally speaking, I'm not sure that there's a big political bias against infrastructure investment in some jurisdictions. The other aspect, the indebtedness and the fiscal capacity is probably the biggest constraint that they face, like the fiscal capacity, the capacity to raise enough revenues or to borrow to finance these investments. That's maybe where the ideological issues come into play. We don't want to raise the level of debt, or we don't want to spend that much to fully match the federal funding, or if we do, we will reduce other areas of spending not to have too big of a debt.
Can you foresee, if this program goes on, if the federal, provincial, municipal program goes on, can you foresee any of these trends getting stronger in terms of less spending from provinces or not keeping up with Ottawa's expectations, or can you not foresee that?
I cannot anticipate that. If I had that capacity, I wouldn't be in this seat. I'd be much richer, but it's very hard to predict what will happen in the future with these types of programs.
Well, this will be very interesting because obviously this will be germane when we get to the budget next week. We'll be talking about federal programs, and the infrastructure program is a big one. Thank you very much for coming in.
My pleasure.